switch to, that was my Portuguese for the night. So thank you very much for everyone coming here tonight or this afternoon. We have a panel on academic freedom in Brazil and in Hungary. I'm delighted to have Professor Renata Úitz here from the Central European University, who, besides being an outstanding legal scholar, was also my supervisor. Or maybe because of that, I'm joking. And also, I have here Professor Marta Machado from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, and also I have Helena Funari, master's student who is also studying issues related to academic freedom as well. And also, we have on Skype Professor Michelle Raton, who felt sick today actually, but she's going to join us by Skype. So basically, what we have, we're going to have 30 minutes listening to Professor Úitz's opening remarks. And then after that, we're going to have Helena and Michelle talking about the case of Brazil, and Marta comment as well, and then open for questions and debate. Okay, it's going to be in English also because of Professor Úitz, for her to fully understand what you're saying. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Tiago, for the invitation. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Sao Paulo, and I forever wanted to actually see FGV in Rio, because I met so many people over the years that I wanted to see the place for itself. So what follows is a set of remarks on limitations on academic freedom, which can come more suddenly than one expects. And those of you who read the news know that I teach at a university that in 2017, out of the blue, was subject to changes in the Hungarian higher education law. The changes meant that in order for the university to continue to operate in the manner in which it operated until then, would need to meet certain conditions. One of those conditions was for the Hungarian government to sign an international agreement with the foreign country which accredited this foreign private university. The university could never meet these conditions because the government never signed the international agreement, and as a result, the executive decision was taken to move teaching operations that are subject to accreditation to Vienna. I can actually speak without to Vienna, Austria. So if you, I mean, I'm coming clean about this because that. If I don't say this, it doesn't feel fair. If I do say this, then I sound like an expert by experience. So take whatever I say with a grain of salt. And as for the talk on academic freedom, the formal title of this paper is Academic Freedom as a Human Right ? And the way I would like to start this, instead of a proper introduction for a paper, I would like to put 3 pebbles that will mark the zone where we are discussing academic freedom. The first pebble is one that I think I'm becoming the least comfortable with as the time goes by, which is that we people in the civilized world take academic freedom for granted. And this is actually a major problem when it comes under attack. So we are used to thinking that gratuitous attacks on academic freedom and on academics as such happen at other countries, in other places, which are not recognized as proper democracies. So if I tell you that in Turkey, after the coup in 2016, 5,800 academics were dismissed from public universities for signing a petition for or for alleged ties to terrorist organizations, then you will say that, okay, I mean, first of all, it's nice of Human Rights Watch to count the numbers, but also it's Turkey, and we know that things like this happen in Turkey because when we look at the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, there are a bunch of cases where academics faced criminal charges for discussing their research on, say, ethnic diversity or religious minorities in the newspapers. So, you know, but this is a thing that happens in Turkey, and then we sit back and relax, and there is a sigh of relief that, of course, it happens in places which are not our democracies, but we are safe. Until we aren't. Because it seems that with the rise of illiberal populist political actors, when they get elected into government, sooner than later, they will start to impose legal restrictions in the form of pretty anodyne regulations, so regulatory restrictions usually, on scholars and the institutions where they work. Now, this is at this particular moment, when we realize that the problem is not simply that we are subjected to a regulation that we never saw coming, but also that we are extremely light on ammunition when it comes to trying to challenge these measures. We look around and we quickly have to realize that we don't have any solid normative basis in international human rights law or domestic law to make claims to defend academic freedom that we took for granted. And also we don't really have the arguments which match the threat that academic freedom comes under. So this whole notion that academic freedom is evident and this is like the air we breathe, that would be one cornerstone for the discussion. Now, the second one is that, and this is a talk I've given in many places by now in different countries, different institutions, different continents. And I find that academic freedom is an extremely difficult topic to give a paper on because wherever you go, people associate very different problems with it. So let's start at the universal global north. Let's go to the US. If you talk to people about is academic freedom under threat in the US? Definitely. Philosophers will tell you that there is this famous drama back from a few years ago when a philosophy journal published a paper by an untenured philosopher on arguing that if it's possible to transition from one gender to another, then interracial transition is also possible. That was a big hoopla. People, so this is a philosophy paper in a professional journal, making an argument which I so far until then believed that was the job of philosophers to do and then argue it out. Instead of that was a public letter. Members of this person's dissertation committee protested at the journal, and then the journal apologized on Facebook for the harm which the paper caused. Another type of drama which happens in the US all the time, and you actually have people who built careers on this, is the extramural speech by faculty who then suffer consequences in employment for things they said or wrote on Twitter. In the most famous case of Steve Salaita, his job offer was withdrawn after he made some comments on Twitter which were not liked by the donor who was financing the chair, which he didn't get. And then, of course, you have these endless stories about protests on campus, not liking liberal campuses, not liking conservative professors coming and making speeches which they find unacceptable. And I'm not even talking about the limitations on speech, intramural speech by professors, so in the classroom that may trigger anxiety or trauma. Now, when you come to Hungary, then and you ask people about academic freedom, they will say that yes, in 2017 we had this amendment to the higher education law that I just mentioned in the beginning. Then the year after, the government decided to revoke the accreditation and funding for gender studies as such, because the position being that gender studies was an ideology, not a legitimate academic discipline. And this year, if you Google academic freedom in Hungary, then much of the news will be about the changes of funding of the Hungarian academic sciences. So this is all about who receives money for what type of research and whatnot. Now, when we come over, and I decided to go to Chile, because remember the last time when we were actually in Chile at a conference, there was a huge, huge demonstration about university funding and scholarships. A few months before, actually, according to a report by scholars at Risks, the police used violent force against a group of students who were protesting outside the Chilean Constitutional Court against the judgment of the Constitutional Court. The label on the Scholars at Risk website reads "Killings and Disappearances." Now, if you have a little bit of an appetite for human rights and how we conceptualize human rights problems, it should be at least a teeny bit of a concern that the list I gave you has a very diverse set of problems. So an extrajudicial killing is very different from withdrawing funding or changing licensing conditions. So it's pretty clear that when people talk about violations of academic freedom, they talk about a very diverse set of problems, which roughly have to do with universities and people and what people do, both students and scholars at universities. But beyond that, there is really no commonality between these stories, and ultimately human rights is based on storytelling. If you cannot tell a story, then you cannot make a claim. Now, when I put on my lawyer hat, then I have to admit that in international and regional human rights instruments, there is extremely little on academic freedom. So people then always say that, you can trust the Germans on this and go to the German basic law. The German basic law will have an article, which it has. It says that arts and sciences, research and teaching shall be free. Now, that is very, very lovely. It's part of the free speech clause. That's the last bit. To give a reality check on whether this is the standard formulation, I can take you to Hungary, to the new fundamental law, which has a very long provision on academic freedom, and it opens with the following sentence: Hungary shall ensure the freedom of scientific research and artistic creation, blah, 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 blah. Now, even when I read the first sentence, it's very clear that under the Hungarian fundamental law, academic freedom is not an individual right. It's not the right of a legal entity, but rather it's a pure state obligation. The Hungarian state shall ensure doing certain things. So it's a positive obligation, plain and simple. And even the very core of academic freedom, that is the right to determine scientific truth, is defined from the perspective of the state. So the very same article a little further down says, the state shall have no right to decide on questions of scientific truth. But it's not about your freedom to go and pursue the truth in a university setting. So conceptually, it's a very, very different story. Now, this is at this point, if you look at who talks about academic freedom as a human right, you will find that usually this is the terrain of retired professors. It's typically a history project after you became an emeritus that tells you, and that's actually part of the story of you take it for granted. So you really don't deal with this until you have run out from all the other things that you had to say. One exception is the former dean of Yale Law School, Robert Post, who has several articles on academic freedom and even a book. And it's very interesting how Post frames academic freedom. He frames it in the context of freedom of expression under the First Amendment, And he believed the core of his approach is that academic freedom is the creation of expert knowledge. In an article, he actually says, it's a book review article, but that doesn't make it any less smart, that academic freedom exists to protect the ability of academics to pursue professional tasks. So it's not a concern for human freedom generally, as he writes, but rather the autonomy of the scholarly profession. So you can already see that this is a very, very narrow phrasing. And of course it has to do with the fact that he phrases it in the context of the American Constitution as a free speech right. In the book on academic freedom, which is called Democracy, Expertise, and Academic Freedom, he opens the chapter on academic freedom with the following sentence, which I will also read out, and then I promise I won't do this any further. But this is actually very interesting. The value of democratic competence is undermined whenever the state acts to interrupt the communication of disciplinary knowledge that might inform the creation of public opinion. So remember, he starts from the creation of expert knowledge, but actually he believes that there is constitutional protection for the product, that is expert knowledge, if you communicate it in order to contribute to the creation of public opinion and in the democratic process. So this is extremely far from studying patterns of ice, unless if you actually have something to say about this in the public discourse. You really have no constitutional relevance for what we otherwise label as academic freedom. Now, just keep this definition in mind and remember all those examples that I gave that are traditionally in common parlance are associated with violations of academic freedom, because the gap is enormous. And when you think about Post's definition, what is striking about it is it is talking about the rights of individuals and not about the institutions. So there is not even a single moment where the core of the right is explained in terms of the autonomy of institutions, that is university autonomy, where these people actually produce that knowledge. Now, with this in mind, without going too much into the details of the CEU story, you will probably know from the press that early on an expert body in the Council of Europe, the Venice Commission, said that they were really not happy with this amendment of the higher education law because it applies to functioning universities and not only to newcomers, and also because they find that there is too much government discretion in the conditions, and they really believe that the measures chosen, that is the conditions, do not speak to the aims of the law. Now, when I summarize the opinion, there is not a single word in this summary about academic freedom. These are rule of law concerns about predictability, foreseeability of legal obligations, and the nature of the obligation related to the purpose of the law. But these are really formal questions about how you regulate a subject, and the Venice Commission actually notes that these conditions would probably, by and large, be fine for newcomers, but not for functioning institutions. Now, when the European Commission in the European Union was unhappy with the Hungarian law, they started an infringement procedure, which then went to the court. The Commission is a little bit of a secretive body, so you don't really have access to the complaint that they file with the court. You have to work on the basis of the press release. Now, on the basis of the press release, what you find that what the Commission is after is protecting freedom of enterprise and the free movement of capital. And then they mention human rights further down the line, but it's a difficult proposition in the EU because the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights protects a bunch of rights when it's the Union or member states enforcing EU law that is the actor. But a member state domestically, sadly, is not really an actor they are after under the Charter. This may have changed a little bit under recent case law, but that's not too much of a concern for us. And I will tell you in a second why. Just keep in mind that the strongest case the Commission could mount was to protect the capital that was invested in the university in an environment where the very same Commission spends euro millions every year to the very same institutions, that is universities, for research and also teaching and student mobility. If you think it's a little funny, then probably we are in the same camp. Now, why did I say that it's not much of a, it wouldn't have been much of a relief had the Commission tried to argue on academic freedom grounds? It's because there is extremely little in European human rights law. So it's very clear, I mean, one thing that is clear from European human rights law is the rights of the students have nothing to do, so the access to education has nothing to do with academic freedom. And when you look at the European human rights jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, then you will find that the bulk of the case law they have has to do with free speech protection for professors who said something in the press and then faced criminal prosecution for that. So all of these cases are decided as free speech cases, and the logic is extremely similar to what I just gave you from Professor Post. That is, what is protected is not research itself, it's the contribution that a professor makes on the basis of that research to the public discourse in a free and democratic society. What also receives another aspect of academic freedom that receives some protection as an individual right is access to information. So this is good news for historians and people who want access to state-held information. But again, this protection is also only there if the data that you want access to is going to result in some contribution to the public discourse. This is because the speech frame applies to access to information as well. There is one case in 2014. It's a case of a Turkish academic. His name is Mustafa Erdogan, where in a joint concurring opinion, Judges Shayo, Vucinic, and Kuris were actually trying to argue that this approach, which makes academic freedom into an individual right that matters only if you contribute to the public discourse, is not really helpful to protect academic freedom at large. And they try to explain that without giving protection in a meaningful manner to the extramural dimension, the convention will not offer much. Now, the real question is where will this protection for the institutional or extra and intramural dimension come from? In 2018, so last year, one of the chambers of the court handed down a judgment in a case which had some potential. This case came from Montenegro, and roughly what happened was that at one of the faculties, a dean decided to install cameras in the classroom in order to monitor the quality of teaching. So the national data protection law actually made it possible to install cameras in order to protect property or persons. So if you wanted to stop theft or the destruction of chairs, that would be a valid purpose, but not the surveillance of teaching. The professors who were unhappy about this policy brought a case under Article 8 of the Convention, which protects private life. Now, the chamber was split 4-3, so that's the sharpest split. The majority argued that and you will really love this, that because professors develop mutual relations in the classrooms with their students, that was an aspect of private life. So this is professional life, which is also a protected aspect of private life. And since this is how you develop your identity, surveillance in the classroom comes under Article 8 of the Convention, protecting private life. And then after it came under the Convention, they said that, look, because national data protection rules did not allow surveillance for quality assurance purposes, only to protect property, the measure didn't have a proper legal basis in national law. So it's super technical, it's super narrow. What's interesting is the debate between the majority and the dissenters. There is a concurring opinion by two justices on the majority who try to explain that they fully see that this is not private life and home and correspondence in the classic sense, the very words of Article 8, but they believe that the university setting is a very special one, and so the court has a role to play here. The dissenting justices, led by Judge Spano, who is, by the way, a great advocate of subsidiarity and the court pulling back, was saying that no, this is an unacceptable expansion of the convention to protect the classroom and what happens in the classroom in this particular manner. A classroom is a quasi-public setting, it's a professional activity, and so long as the professors knew about the cameras, they have to live with it. The convention doesn't apply at all. So the bottom line is that on the one hand, the dissenters have a very different take on the nature of the university environment, and I have to concede that the Spano position is very close to a free speech logic. So you treat the classroom as a quasi-public square. It's like a public place or a parking lot where you hand out flyers, and you take what professors say as public speech. Just keep in mind that this was not a free speech case. It was argued in terms of the special characteristics of what happens in a university classroom. The reason, however, why I find the judgment and this debate a bit of a big concern is that by 2018, the court is deciding this case in an environment where the space of academic freedom is shrinking extremely fast in Europe. There are governments which take measure after measure in order to put universities and the professors into a smaller and smaller corner, and the ECHR doesn't seem to be interested in this at all. That is the context in which they are delivering this judgment. So all in all, the lesson is that in Europe you have extremely little protection to academic freedom as a human right. If it's a human right, it's a right of individuals for their contributions to the public discourse. We clearly are not talking about institutions. We clearly are not talking about university autonomy. So there are all these political pronouncements and resolutions about university autonomy. That doesn't come into play at all. And it's very, very clear that the types of measures that illiberal governments are using, that is playing with funding, playing with accreditation, playing with university salaries, playing with scholarships, those measures are extremely far from the arena where human rights arguments are made. So for the time being, illiberal populist rulers can absolutely be confident that when they take stabs at academic freedom, via funding and these type of quality assurance regulations, the European human rights regime will not step in that way. This actually means that it's extremely difficult for human rights advocates on the national level to mount any kind of sensible argument within the rules of human rights litigation that would stick and hurt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Úitz. And thank you very much for being so strict to the time. So I'll hand over to Michele. Michele? Só um minuto.
Can you hear me?
Um pouco o som.
Hello?
It's perfect now.
Okay, great. Can you hear me well? Yes, good. So first of all, I'd like to thank Thiago for organizing this meeting, and above all for being so gentle to offer and organize my virtual participation today. So it's a great pleasure to share this roundtable with Professor Renata Úitz. Thanks for joining us at FGV. The case of Hungary is followed by us with surprise, as well as we are following the situation in Brazil today. The perplexity that is exactly what provoked the three of us, Marta, Elena, and I, to develop the idea of a joint paper describing the attacks to the university in Brazil and a contrast with other countries' experience. Elena and I will just present an ongoing paper. Its preliminary version was presented at the Law and Society meeting this year, and we are now adding more information about international similar experiences and national developments. But this is a new field of research to all of us. The focus is on the attacks to high-level education in Brazil, the university space, and the freedom of ideas, and above all, the rule of laws. I'll just present the first data for the sake of your understanding, and Elena will conclude. So if you can follow for the presentation, can we change?
Yes.
Great.
So we have the presentation.
Okay, great. We can go to the second slide, please. Great. We have organized our talk in 4 parts. 2 of them are about the context for universities in Brazil and the most recent attacks to universities. The third is about our focus of analysis, and the fourth is a couple of questions to explore commonalities with the scenario in Hungary and around the world. So our first point, as part of the local, it's the next slide, of the local components of attacks to university in Brazil, we see that public university is at the center of scientific knowledge. Although we have in the first graph that public universities respond to 37% of universities in Brazil, they are also responding to 83% of the scientific production in the country. So any action by the state can firmly attack the scientific production in the country. That is one of the points of these graphs. For the next slide, we can see that the case of attacks to the university in Brazil is also associated with economic and connected racial aspects are at the center of the dispute. Our first graph shows that the groups of mixed race and Black people increased in public universities in Brazil up to 2014. This shows the loss of exclusive access to the privileged space for the production of knowledge. This has also destabilized the social forces in the intellectual debate in Brazil. The second graph gives emphasis to the socio-economic dimension of the access to the university. Lower classes have had more access, as well as families, especially those with 1 to 3 minimum wage salaries. As a result, we see more social mobility and new intellectual groups disputing ideas and places in the society in Brazil. Our next slides will mention how much the conservative ideas are resisting to that move and picking on some topics to attack university and new ideas brought by these changes. So, Elena,
Okay,
you have the floor.
it's working. So, following the hello, okay. So, following the presentation structure, we analyze now the discourses that took place during the electoral period and enhanced the attacks to universities. But before that, we retrospect a little bit in time, so it's better to understand the origins of these discourses. We started in 2004 when the movement School Without Ideology was created by the lawyer Miguel Najibe. So he founded the movement after his daughter told him that her teacher had placed the revolutionary leader Che Guevara and San Francis of Assis as equal during a classroom discussion. Moving to 2011 now, we have another important juncture. So a material prepared by the Ministry of Education named School Without Homophobia, which aimed at promoting diversity in school, was denounced as an instrument to promote homosexuality among children and destroy family, being maliciously termed as gay kid by the opposition. At last, the fight to eliminate gender-sensitive language and sex education reaches the national, statewide, and municipal plans of education. Clauses that stated that one of the goals of public education is to promote gender equality were eliminated. So finally, we arrive at the electoral period on August 1st, 2018, when the universities became one of candidates Bolsonaro's main target. As Bolsonaro's discourse got more and more radical, for instance, defending dictatorship, torture, and attacking universities, we see a mobilization of the civil society to defend democracy. On October 18th, students and university workers signed the Letter of Universities for Democracy, which sought to defend the rule of law, democracy, the autonomy of education, and freedom of education. But we also see a counter-movement motivated by Bolsonaro's radical discourses. In October, universities reported manifestations of intolerance, racism in its campus. I will give some examples. So at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora, swastika symbols were drawn and messages such as death to gays were written all over the campus walls. Beyond the polarized dispute around the language of fundamental rights, the judiciary also played an important and controversial role. As protests for democracy took place in universities, electoral public prosecutors sued these movements for unlawful campaign activities. Granting the request, local judges and the regional electoral courts ordered immediate searches and seizures in universities, as well as the confiscation of pamphlets, posters, and the interruption of the public debate. The judicial dispute eventually reached the Supreme Court in a request for constitutional review proposed by the chief federal prosecutor. The day before the second round of the elections, the Supreme Court granted a preliminary injunction suspending all the warrants previously conceded. So after that, we have the election which ended with Bolsonaro's victory. Further on, we would like to highlight some events and trends we can see in the first 120 days of the elections. So first, we had the first education ministry that declared that it has the intention to fight cultural Marxism, but after 3 months of turbulent administration, he was replaced. So during Ministry's Weintraub office, the new appointed ministry, we have one of the greatest crises in Brazilian education. So overnight budget cuts in the amount of 30% were determined for all federal universities, and the ministry announced the budget restrictions after stating that universities are a place of disorder, since they are making too much noise. So along with the 30% restrictions, more than 1,000 postgraduate scholarships were canceled, many of them which were expected by students already selected in master's and doctoral programs. These policies have not gone unnoticed by the civil society, so on May 15th, more than 2,000 cities hosted protests against the budget restrictions measures. Reacting to that, on May 26th, Bolsonaro supporters also had held protests all over the country. And lastly, on May 30th, we had another manifestation in defense of the education. Notwithstanding these demonstrations, the president issued a decree that allows more intervention for the president in the appointment of chancellors for federal universities. So beyond the Brazilian case, we intend here to make a comparative analysis of the attacks on the universities worldwide. We want to highlight that this is a working paper, so we share here some initial ideas we have concerning the topic. First, the attacks on universities happen on a within a broader trend in direction to autocratic or far-right governments. In a sense, that both phenomena are intertwined. We see the attacks on university both as a consequence of the movement and as a strategy to further perpetuation in power. Second of all, from an analytical point of view, we divide the discussion regarding the universities in two perspectives. So the first one is about the meaning of rule of law and the content of fundamental rights, such as right of education, freedom of thought, right of expression, right of assembly, students' freedom of learning, teachers' freedom of expression in the classroom. What we see, although these rights might not have been assured to all citizens, especially in Brazil equally, they are more intensively in dispute. Moreover, we see an international erosion of meanings we thought were settled, at least in the international arena or the public sphere. And the second perspective is that we can track the violations according to the state branch, whether the executive, the legislative, or the judiciary. So, for example, in the Brazilian case, whereas the legislative and the executive powers are the sources of attacks, the Supreme Court tried to secure the freedom of speech in universities during the 2018 elections. And here we would like to propose some questions for Renata. And I think the third one would be something that you didn't mention, but it would be interesting to hear from you, like which branches of the state articulated the attacks. So if you can see some difference between these branches. And in Brazil, for example, we have some differentiation. And another thing we would like to hear about is the role that the social movements played in response to these attacks.
Just a comment that underline our research is that I would say the affinities between neoliberal policies and attacks to the universities, because every the budgetary cuts could be defended on. First, there was not the first time there were budgetary cuts to universities. Of course, this time was extreme because it was like overnight cuts and it was massive cuts, but it's not new in our recent history. And second, it was justified as a neoliberal politics. So it's a thin line between right-wing and neoliberal policy and authoritarian measure. So I think this is also something that we have to, as you mentioned, there are these subtle ways to attack university and academic freedom, like scholarships, salaries, accreditation policies. So I think there are some affinities between these policies and these new techniques so we need to rethink our concepts of where the line of the democracy is. And I think the second thing that called our attention, especially during the electoral period, was how the Brazilian judiciary were ready to impose censorship in the universities. So it was the electoral judges that were easily given measures to forbid academic discourses, forbid academic events. So it was something that called the attention. It was the Supreme Court reversed that, but it was also it was not. It was something natural to our judiciary. How it was, they were very comfortable to issue a lot of measures that were interfering in academic freedom. I think these two issues were something that we would like to give more attention. The role of the law, how universities can be destroyed and academic freedom can be, in the end of the day, eroded by means that can look like that are not illegal, blatant illegal.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much, Michele, Helena, e Marta. So I think I just want to add one thing to the set of questions to Renata, and then I think we could pass to Renata for some comments and then questions for anyone who has them. One question is that we hear a lot about Hungary here nowadays, especially with the close links between Orban and Bolsonaro. I wonder whether this relationship travels the other way around as well, in the sense of whether you hear about the developments in Brazil, when you hear about Brazil in Hungary, in that sense of learning from what's happening here. And secondly, I just want to also add to what Marta was saying, Helena and Michele, about the funding part. I know that there was an issue with the Academy of Science as well recently in Hungary. If you could explain a bit that, but also there is a discussion here about the role of Supreme Court in enforcing academic freedom, but especially in relation to the freedom of speech framework. So you have the very strong decision from the Supreme Court during the election time about against censorship on political debate in universities, but I'm not sure whether the Supreme Court is actually capable in terms of the framework that they have developed to actually curb any attacks on academic funding, or even a combination between academic funding and politically sensitive debates. So nowadays we have seen that some events that are seen as politically motivated, the funders are being cutted or not, or rejected, and then academics are looking for other fund sources internationally, but also at the state level, because we have some state level agencies, not necessarily at the federal level. So whether what kind of framework would you think it's possible to help this area of law that you said is not very much developed in terms of the institutional protection of those institutions? Because my sense is that our Supreme Court is we are very happy about their decisions on censorship, not only in terms of the universities, but also recent censorship on books in a book fair in Rio and so on. But I think, in considering the jurisprudence of the court, this is the easy case. It looks very politically strong, but in terms of legal terms, it's not very difficult to decide on that way. But I think when you go to the funding and other more subtle things, it will be harder for them to decide where the funding should go and things like this. So if you could comment on that in like 5-7 minutes, and then we can. Or more.
Yeah, it's so probably 5-7 for you, and thank you very much for the questions. And I have to say that that this was really fascinating to listen to, partly because of the similarities. So the whole idea of financial controls through direct funding of universities, through scholarships, through university salaries is by now we can say that it's part of the liberal toolkit. It's a recipe, and this is how you go after universities. You also do cut research funding, and this is where the battle about the Academy of Sciences lies is really crucial. So as soon as researchers do not get to determine what they find worthy of exploring in the pursuit of knowledge, then you already have restrictions. In an environment where there is extremely little private money is available for research of this kind, that is scientific or academic research. Essentially, the most important donor is the state. Now, the difference in Europe is that you also can apply to competitive European grants. In reality, in order to attract competitive European grants of this kind, any university has to have several employees who assist with the applications and assist with the grants. So it requires a serious investment on the university's side, and these grants favor those who have already won several times. So to win this at a small university, which is not prepared, which is provincial and not part of the big European academic networks, it's almost hopeless. And of course, there is money that you actually have to spend on the project. So you employ people for the project. It doesn't go to paying others on the faculty, and research grants of this kind do not fund teaching, which is what ultimately is a very big task of all public universities. Now to finish the funding point, this is where you have least hope, partly because courts are reluctant to reassess redistributive decisions, and partly because and courts are reluctant to do that because there is a very strong democratic or counter-majoritarian objection. If the democratically elected representatives of the people decide that instead of universities you will build hospitals or stadiums, a court will not say that you need to spend more on professors' salaries. The model of chancellors is also something that is familiar. So this is definitely the recipe. And when it comes to funding, that's where human rights arguments really run out as direct challenges. To answer the concrete questions, there was plenty of mobilization, especially in support of CEU. You have these letters with Nobel Prize winners and all the universities, left, right, and super conservative religious ones, being pretty outraged. With pretty big protests. Now these didn't move an inch. So when it came to the Academy of Sciences, you can see that international journals like The Lancet and Nature are writing about the funding conundrum, and that makes zero difference. So it's good publicity, and it helps you because it's in English, and then you can add links to your footnotes. But it didn't change a bit the government policy. What was very interesting is that you had a series of student protests. And a student protest is a difficult animal because it's extremely difficult to project it and visually in the media when the people who are at the demo are the people who would sit at grandma's table at lunch on Sunday. So student protests are difficult for these regimes because the kids themselves are extremely difficult to demonize. The Hungarian government decided to police these protests slightly differently. What happened was, and I think it's really crucial, is that every demonstration officially has a beginning and an end. So there is a physical point, a real objective point when you have to go home. It was a very interesting development where people walking home from a demo on the street were stopped by police for a traffic violation for walking on the road instead of walking on the sidewalk. Probably the reason why we know about this is because police were also stopping journalists and photojournalists, and the first thing photojournalists did were calling the lawyers whether they really need to show their actual ID instead of their photo accreditation to the police for a traffic violation. So it became a big hoopla, but you can easily see how this kind of an intervention, that is a policeman stopping you when you are 16 or 17, applying to university, especially applying to professions which require for graduation a clean criminal record, such as, for instance, a law degree, it's not very good when you have a police case for demonstrations. So this is using, and that comes to your next question about how the branches of government react. So this is low-level administrative policing. It's not violent, you're just being ID'd, and maybe a week from now, a policeman will knock on your door and your Grammy or your mom will have to let you or not to answer questions. There is also a pretty prominent case about the demonization of a student activist who spoke at a protest that received public attention. Now, when it comes to what the government is doing and what the various branches are doing, so you have the legislative layer, which is statutory changes and amendments. Budgeting is also a legislative competence. You have myriads of administrative opportunities for intervening. Courts are of not much use because for that you need actual government action that you can challenge. So in the case of CEU, and that's very crucial, under the law which was passed, the Hungarian government could have now for months revoked the operational license of the foreign private university that is the American accredited institution to operate in Hungary. They didn't do that. So technically, under the law, the education authority could come and any time withdraw the license. And there is very good reason for that. That would actually be administrative action that you can challenge in court. If you can challenge it in court, then the court can ask a preliminary question from the European Court of Justice. Also, if you manage to exhaust domestic remedies, you can go to Strasbourg. But without a measure that you can challenge in court, there is literally nothing that you can do. And this type of a lesson is something that is very clear, partly from examples in Turkey. So in Turkey, the mass harassment of academics, apart from firings, also includes taking their passports. The way this goes is that you are summoned to a police station and you have to hand your passport in. There is no decision about it, so it's something that happens. It's an event in your life, but you don't receive a piece of paper saying that, and now I took your passport and that was it. And because there is no government action that you can challenge in court, there is no litigation about it. So long as you can go to court, that actually keeps the doors of the inter-American system open, in addition to the Brazilian system, which is crucial. And so the toolkit is very nuanced. And I think that lack of action is sometimes as problematic as action itself. And then we have the Hungarian Constitutional Court, so the amendment of the higher education law that affects my university was challenged by a group of deputies before the Constitutional Court. CEU also tried a direct constitutional complaint. The Constitutional Court was silent for a while, and then they decided to suspend the case in order to wait for the judgment of the European Court of Justice. Now, this is seen by international observers as judicial dialogue, how the Hungarian Constitutional Court is being nice to the European Court. It's a matter of courtesy. You don't want to cross paths. But as some of the justices themselves in the case point out, actually the case before the Hungarian Constitutional Court and the case before the European Court of Justice do not raise the same issue. So technically, there was absolutely no pressure on the Constitutional Court to do that. So don't take judicial protection for granted, and keep in mind that in the European setting, if you have judicial protection, that already means that there was some sort of action that you could challenge in court. And let me just go back to yeah, because that was actually something. So the free speech connection. What you saw in the European Court of Human Rights cases, there's this emphasis on the free speech of the academics. And that is a very, very narrow, very narrow framing. What hasn't been explored and would be very much worth doing, and that ultimately could, for instance, take you to talking about funding and scholarships indirectly, is to open up a little bit the discussion about the purpose of university in a democracy beyond the individual speech rights of academics. And this is going to be an aha moment for some people and a relief for others. Your starting point here is actually Brown versus Board of Education. Because it was in Brown versus Board of Education where the Supreme Court said, and I will read this out because it feels good, today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws and great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, even service in the armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. If you do not fund public education, including universities, you lose the citizens who are participants of this public debate. So you need, in order to make the speech argument work, and at the moment, that's the strongest argument you have, the focus needs to be shifted not to the speakers, but equally to the audience. Because if people don't understand the arguments, then you don't have a functioning democracy with a functioning, robust public discourse. And I think that Brown v. Board is a very, very good starting point for that, and especially in a setting where racial injustice is so severe. Not using Brown would really be some sort of a professional misconduct at this point.
Thank you very much, Renata. So I will hand over the moderation to Marta because I have to leave to talk at the Bar Association on the banality of evil, which is not so different topic from what we are talking now. And for questions and this.
Yes, I guess I will immediately open the floor for questions. Comments, remarks.
Thank you. My name is Gustavo. I'm a student from the second year in the master's program here. I also happen to work at the Consulate of Hungary, but I'm here as a student. Well, my question is about your research, and when you developed the trajectory of the debate on academic freedom, I was thinking that maybe you could have included the Science Without Borders from the point of view of thematic restraint. And in a way, as an economist by background, I'm used to thinking in terms of cost of opportunity. So I suppose Science Without Borders was focusing on development, but from a technical point of view, and humanities and social sciences, law were not subjects that were disciplines that were included. And I don't know, I'd like to know your opinion about this.
No, that's a very good question. First, I discovered recently that Science Without Borders were not covering humanities, and I was a little bit shocked. But I think what I would say is that for many things we see here, there are some history. So that's part of the difficult task we have to say here we cross the line, because we have had some problems before. Like this is of course one bias against the humanities, which is now a huge problem, because it's like there is a line of continuity when we see, for example, the Ministry of Education saying we will invest only in profitable professions like engineering, agronomy, and something like that. So I think you're right. There is.
I think it's interesting because it happened during a government which had a very different orientation, and in particular, very different orientation in terms of human rights. And well, like the Quotas Act was brought into force by Dilma's government. So that other big change in terms of racial and socio-economic composition in public universities happened during that government as well. So it's
troubling. That's what I have to say. But I think it's interesting to see that some things are, of course, there are some clear and evident. There are some areas that are more clear, and there are some that are not so clear. For example, I've been studying, you were mentioning police protesting. And there was something very similar that what happened here in Brazil in 2013, that the police would take people to the police department, and they wouldn't register anything. So what the public defenders were doing at the time was like obliging the police to make a report that they took these people to the police station, because otherwise they couldn't do anything in the judiciary. And when we look at the situation of protest or freedom of protest in Brazil, we see that it was the strongest legislation against protesting was issued during Dilma's government because of the World Cup. So it's like there were, of course, and now it can be used in a very sensitive moment. We have a very stark. We have the whole apparatus prepared to repress protests. So I think it's also interesting to see some continuities and how we have been feeding some illiberal measures for a long time. And now we have a whole, and now that we have a whole package, everything seems more worrisome or something like that. I didn't want to talk so much.
Here in Brazil, when you see the discussion about the budget, especially the international budget, and the teams, which area the research will be done or something like that, what we see that we have a very, we have a strong part inside of the university and inside of the schools. Like, I think that the best example is São Carlos Federal University, where you have a dean which is aligned with the government. And she knows that she can just say, oh, I will not funding sociology, I will not funding philosophy, I will just fund engineer. But how take this kind of case to judiciary if the dean has the authority to do that? Is it and here in Brazil, I think that we have a worst situation because it's very hard to do this continuity from freedom to research to good citizens. Because here education is still a fight for most part of the citizens. So it's hard to say, oh, you have to put money and to fund academic research because it's important for the future. Okay, but we don't have schools for the lower income classes. How to deal with all these things?
Well, to actually go back to some of your earlier discussion about universities being spots of trouble, that's part of the reason why you don't get terribly far with formalized protection for university autonomy. So if you look at universities wherever you do, these are usually understood to be sites of revolution, sites of disruption. So the whole approach of making university autonomy and academy and anything that has to do with universities and university learning a pure and naked state obligation as opposed to a fundamental right means that you let the one regulate who is the most likely to be afraid of the disruption that comes from this center of trouble. So there is good reason why the Prussian government, when they were limiting public assembly, historically speaking, they didn't like more than 3 students to be gathered in one spot, because that was clearly a site of trouble. If you go to one of my favorite places, Burma, universities were literally neutered because every single social disruption / revolution started at a university campus. And the way to go about this was to use universities as a tool of social control. So you actually impose obligations of continuing education through a combination of distance learning and physical presence, and you make people travel to various campuses across time without leaving or opening dormitories for them. So essentially, it becomes an obligation to attend university, and the government knows where you are because you are either in a classroom or traveling between your registered home and your registered place of education. So much of the control function is not achieved through the streamlining of the curriculum, which we didn't talk about at all, but simply with putting people in classrooms who do not want to be there and making them shuttle. So there are certainly more extreme measures, and the point I was hoping to make is that these particular measures of control are chosen because these are the most difficult to litigate in human rights terms. And what I find amazing, apart from apart from the funding dispute, is that, of course, we didn't speak about how universities are elite institutions. You don't need experts. You need the real people, as opposed to the elite, because that's also the type of rhetoric that makes it extremely difficult to challenge restrictions on funding. So, and the little I understand about Brazil is that these arguments on privilege and elite access to goods that are not available to others is a narrative and a rhetoric which is extremely easy to mobilize.
Okay, so we are, yeah, that was really interesting to compare, and the kind of, yeah, troubling to see how the methods are so similar. And I think this dialogue has to be more and more frequent as we are facing the same problem. We are here trying to start a group to understand, to track government measures and also strategies of resistance. And I think this aims to be an international network. So this was like the first time we really sit with somebody who is a little bit ahead of us in this sense. And it's a very interesting dialogue that really puts light on what we are living and the dangers we are facing. But it's, yeah, that was, I really would like to thank you for coming here and for being here this evening with us. And thank you, Lena and Michelle, for sharing our work, and all of you for coming to this debate.